The tea-room in Little Malling had a way of keeping up appearances, much as a dowager might preserve the faint scent of lavender long after the blooms had withered. Its lace curtains hung stiffly starched, the tables wore their antimacassars like ceremonial garments, and the silver urn gleamed so brightly one might have mistaken it for a shrine rather than a vessel for boiling water. It was the sort of place where time pretended to stand still, though the clock on the mantel ticked with such officious vigor that one suspected it was compensating for something. On this particular Thursday afternoon, the usual assortment of respectable villagers, spinsters with embroidery, retired majors with rheumatism, and clergymen with opinions on cricket, had come to take their tea and whisper benign gossip under the pretext of discussing the price of scones. Yet it was the empty chair at the corner table, draped in a shawl of suspicious neatness, that drew more than casual attention. A cup, still faintly steaming, rested upon its saucer. No one admitted to pouring it. No one admitted to drinking from it. But there it sat, the last cup, as it would later be called, with its faint rim of lipstick and a single crystallized sugar cube melting in quiet martyrdom. Lord Peter Whimsy, entering with a breeze and an air of absent-minded gaiety, was far less preoccupied with the scone debate than with the question of why a teacup should be left so reverently untouched. He bowed extravagantly to the startled proprietress, complimented her on the positively Danton shadows cast by her gas lamps, and inquired, quite without introduction, whether she had noticed anyone leaving the room backwards. She had not, though she assured him that no one had left forwards either. The police, when called, would later mutter about silly theatrics and prying aristocrats. But Whimsy had already taken his seat, adjusting his monocle to study the cup with the dispassion of a medieval scholar before a relic. The lipstick shade, an unfortunate mauve, told its own story. The shawl's precise folding suggested an owner more careful in departure than most, and the faint smell, not of bergamot, but of something more acrid, drifted across the lace. "It is," Whimsy remarked to no one in particular, "a curious thing how people never notice the manner in which an absence is arranged. Presence is noisy, absence is stage-managed." Thus the afternoon turned from polite refreshment to perplexity. The shawl, the cup, the lipstick, and the chair would soon unravel domestic secrets, summon up resentments brewed stronger than Assam, and provide Lord Peter Whimsy with precisely the kind of afternoon diversion that had, in the past, proved so fatal to the guilty and so exasperating to the innocent. The proprietress came bustling from behind the counter with the air of one summoned to account for providence. She was a neat woman, compact and glossy as a polished walnut, with a name tag that, despite the village's resistance to innovation, announced her as Mrs. Vale in tidy enamel. Whimsy, who had been observing the cup as though it might begin to confess of its own accord, rose and bowed in a manner which in less self-possessed persons tends to compel truth-telling. "If, Mrs. Vale would be so excessively obliging," he said, "as to tell me whether that particular cup bears the usual association of a particular patron, I should be grateful. The tea, I think, has been poured within the last 3 minutes. The steam proceeds not so much from enthusiasm as from physics." Mrs. Vale's mouth, which had been set to repel boarders, relaxed by a 1/4 inch. "We keep no special cups for special people, my lord," she said, "for in Little Malling even the humble retain a delicate ear for honorifics. But that table is often Miss Clevenger's. Thursdays, after the dressmaking. She takes China tea and 1 sugar. I don't say this is hers. I only say it looks like it." "China tea and 1 sugar," murmured Whimsy, leaning to sniff the fading steam. "Yes, but we have here 1 sugar melting, and none yet dissolved. And this, if you will forgive the liberté, is not the perfume of bergamot, but of something unromantic in the liniment line. Do you administer embrocations with your muffins?" "Certainly not," said Mrs. Vale, shocked. "We are a respectable house. I'm sure you may ask Edna." She poured it. Edna proved to be a girl of 19 with a complexion like a well-scrubbed apple and an apron that aspired to inoffensiveness. She arrived clutching a teaspoon as though it were a talisman. "I poured the tea, my lord," she said, eyes wide. "I brought it direct from the urn when the clock chimed the quarter. I set it down and turned to fetch the scone, and when I came back the chair was empty again. Only—" She hesitated and looked towards Mrs. Vale, who encouraged her with a frown. "Only the shawl had been folded proper. I never fold so tidy in a hurry." "Fascinating," said Whimsy. "Absence neatly folded and placed. What moved you to pour for an empty chair?" "She came in, sir, my lord, only not properly in. She was at the door. I saw the mauve." "Well, the mouth," said Edna, flushing. "Miss Clevenger wears it, but not that shade. This was more like Mrs. Darnell, who works at the chemist's, but she never comes Thursdays." The lady put the shawl down, said, "A pot of china. 1 sugar. I won't be a minute." And she stepped back, like she'd forgot something. I poured, as one does, and then there was the bell. Mr. Blaggs came in with his bicycle clips and wanted a packet of chocolate. I turned, only a second, and then, well, no lady. "Did she step back into the street or further into your establishment?" asked Whimsy lightly. Edna looked helpless. "Only backwards, my lord," Mrs. Vale said with authority. "She can't have gone far. We have only the door to the street and the corridor to the kitchen." "Anyone going kitchenwards would have me to reckon with optimistic," said Whimsy. He adjusted his monocle and considered the lace, the gas lamps, the officiously conscientious clock. "Tell me, Mrs. Vale, what hour does Miss Clevenger customarily present herself for the consolations of China tea?" "Between 4 and half past, regular as the post," said Mrs. Vale. "She likes to watch the 4:20 charabanc pass the window and call it vulgar. She says it puts her in the proper humor for pastry. Admirable discipline," said Whimsy. "And today she has not yet come," said Mrs. Vale, a little triumphantly, as though Miss Clevenger's delinquency vindicated the house against slander. The empty chair, the folded shawl, the faint mauve of the cup's rim, and that obstinate whiff, Whimsy's nose, which was better trained than most to separate the morale from the material, suggested carbolic, the respectable tang of a town that washed its hands of things. He lifted the cup by its handle with a delicacy that would have become a thurible and examined the interior. "Milk last," he said dreamily, "or I shall abandon my faith in civilization." Edna. "Milk last," said Edna with a blush that hinted she might have done otherwise on a bad day. A retired major, who had followed events with the stiff-necked relish of a man who distrusts modern plot but appreciates a good line of battle, cleared his throat. "If it's any odds to you, sir," he said, "there was a female at the door 5 minutes ago, before his lordship came in. Stood there like a cat deciding about rain. Dark coat, hat with some sort of, what do the women call it? Quill. Thursday, hats are often more emphatic than rationale," said Whimsy. "Did you observe her approach the table?" "I observed her observe the table," said the major, satisfied with his precision. "Then the vicar spoke to me about a parish hall glazing, and when I next turned, vanished. No idea in which direction. Vicar had blocked my flank. The vicar, a kindly person whose spectacles insisted on slipping to the very brink of moral disaster, raised his hands. 'I do beg your pardon. The glazing is frightful. One hears everything in the hall, every whisper, and not one syllable in the sermon is audible.' 'Soundproofing and sermons are often at cross purposes,' said Whimsy. 'You said you heard everything. Did you hear anything out of place this quarter hour?' 'Only the bicycle bell, twice,' said the vicar. 'Mr. Blaggs always rings when he enters and again when he departs. He seems to regard it as a salutation.' 'Two rings,' repeated Whimsy, glancing at the clock. 'At the quarter and 2 minutes after, perhaps.' 'Edna, your recollection.' 'The first when I turned to the counter,' said Edna. 'The second when I brought the scone and saw, well, nothing. I didn't like to scream.' Mrs. Vale doesn't allow it. Quite right, said Mrs. Vale, grimly pleased. Screaming lowers the tone. The door admitted at that moment a quantity of lawful authority in the person of Mr. Blaggs, whose bicycle clips beamed in unconscious corroboration. He halted, taking in the tableau. Begging your pardon, he said, but Mrs. Featherstone says her cream has gone queer, and is it the heat? Is there any heat? He stared at the cup. What's this, then? An invitation to logic, constable, said Whimsy. You rang your bell upon entry and departure, did you not? Mr. Blaggs, gratified to find that his habits were the subject of aristocratic inquiry, confessed he had. You did not observe a lady leaving by the door while you stood at the counter purchasing chocolate. Not a one, said Mr. Blaggs. Wouldn't have missed her. Stood with my back to the glass case and my front to the door. Unless she went between 'em like smoke. Smoke has been known to choose odd exits, murmured Whimsy, but it rarely folds shawls. He set down the cup and, with a small nod, Bunter, who had appeared without fuss, the way a well-bred moon appears at a window, produced, as by conjuring, a clean envelope and a pair of forceps. If you please, my lord, said Bunter, and lifted from the saucer a tide mark of tea that had escaped back to the rim. He folded the tissue with a priestly touch, a most characteristic shade of mauve. And there is, if I may say so, a suggestion of inexpensive talc, the sort that clings like remorse, said Whimsy. Chemist's counter mauve. Not Miss Clevenger's, I think. She affects a shade more literary, pale and discontented. Mrs. Vale, does your shop admit to a back door that leads not to the kitchen but to any useful ambiguity? Only the scullery door, said Mrs. Vale, affronted. And it sticks. It would stick in a lady. Many doors do, said Whimsy. He moved to the window and pulled the lace an inch aside. Outside, the street performed its quiet, petty rites. The charabanc went by with its vulgar horn. A cart of rhubarb stalks made philosophical progress. Two children stared at each other with the intensity of international diplomacy. Against the tea-room wall, just beyond the angle of the window, a narrow passage ran to the side yard where crates and milk churns stood. It was screened from the front by an ornamental trellis bearing a defunct clematis, exactly the sort of theatrical blind that persuades one a thing cannot be behind it because it is not supposed to be seen. He let the lace fall. The lady, he said, arranged an appearance and a disappearance inside the limit of 2 bicycle rings. She had time to set a shawl, order a tea, and remove herself, leaving a kiss of chemist mauve behind as a proxy. Why order tea at all? Because she wished us to think she would be sitting there when, in fact, she meant to be somewhere else. Where? Up to no. Good, said the Major, whose reading of strategy seldom troubled with subtlety. Not necessarily, said Whimsy. Up to something which is, in my experience, even more dangerous. Edna, when you say she stepped back, do you mean she withdrew entirely into the street or only as far as the threshold? As far as the threshold and a little to the side, said Edna, screwing up her face. Like she didn't want to be seen by the room, only to watch it. To watch who else would come in, said Whimsy softly. Or to watch who would not. Mrs. Vale gave a small exclamation. Well, if that isn't Miss Clevenger, she's late. That's who would not. And yet she is now at the window, said the vicar, who had the dubious gift of noticing things at the wrong moment. A thin woman of precise tailoring and implacable taste peered in, saw the group around the corner table, and entered with the air of a person announcing that manners demanded she be surprised. What a to-do, said Miss Clevenger, removing a grey glove finger by finger as though executing a small-scale exorcism. Mrs. Vale, I'm late. There is a cat in my lane. It has opinions. What has happened to my table? Nothing has happened, said Mrs. Vale, then thought better of it. A lady left her cup and shawl. Her shawl? Miss Clevenger inspected the thing. Not mine. I never wear rayon. I perspire at the sight of it. She glanced at the cup. her lip curling faintly at the mauve. And that colour, Mrs. Darnell at the chemist wears it and thinks herself the heroine of a Russian novel. You admire precision, said Whimsy pleasantly. Would you be so very kind as to tell me, Miss Clevenger, exactly how late you are? Miss Clevenger consulted a watch that ticked with hostile efficiency. 12 minutes, she said. I was delayed by a visitor who wished to discuss hems in the idiom of moral philosophy. Lady or gentleman? Asked Whimsy. Neither, said Miss Clevenger. A niece. She seated herself at the next table, not without casting the corner table the look that a dethroned monarch reserves for a usurper's chair. If someone has borrowed my hour, I must borrow theirs. China, Mrs. Vale. Milk-last Whimsy's eyes rested for an instant on the shawl. He lifted it by a corner. It was indeed rayon, with a whisper of the perfumery aisle and something else. Fainter now, like the ghost of carbolic. In the pocket, stitched where a pocket had no right to be, his fingers encountered paper. He drew out a small ticket stub. It bore the imprint of the village reading room's Thursday lecture series, stamped in purple with a title. Silence and Sound, the Architecture of Hearing. Edifying, said Whimsy. One might learn how to be heard when one is quiet, and how to be silent when one is loud. He handed it to Bunter, who took it as though it were a chalice. Bunter, pray remember. Miss Clevenger's gaze sharpened. That is the lecture for tonight, Lord Peter. Mr. Rook is forever talking about acoustics in the parish hall. He says a whisper in the vestibule carries better than an anthem at the altar. If it is true, I shall cease giving money for hymns. Pray do not, said the vicar, distressed. We shall contrive a hymn that whispers. Whimsy smiled and turned to Mr. Blaggs. Constable, would you oblige me by looking down the side passage? It occurs to me that a person might have retreated into it without troubling your bell. Mr. Blaggs departed solemnly and returned with equal solemnity. Milk churns, my lord. And a smell. Of what kind? Of, well, carbolic, like the surgery, said Mr. Blaggs. Dr. Redpath's boy was just now along with a parcel. Might have left Summit. Carbolic would be comforting if one were anxious to avoid fingerprints, said Whimsy, adding as if to himself, or if one had just taken a risk with something sticky. He turned back to the table and, with a courtliness that made everyone present feel complicit, addressed the room. We have, I think, the faint outline of a domestic drama. A woman places her claim, a shawl, a cup, a colour, then effaces herself, but not quite. She watches. She waits for another woman who is usually punctual, and is today 12 minutes late. The bicycle bell gives us our bracket for the trick. Between two polite rings, someone vanished in order to be perfectly placed elsewhere. The question is, where and to what end? Miss Clevenger, who had taken her first sip, set down the cup with a click. If you are suggesting this is some vulgar tale of jealousy, Lord Peter, I should like to be spared. I should like everyone to be spared, said Whimsy, with a sudden gentleness that altered the air about him, but we are not always consulted. Mrs. Vale, forgive me another imposition. Is Mrs. Darnell of the chemists in the habit of visiting your establishment on Thursdays? Never, said Mrs. Vale. She works until 6, and her husband is particular. She does, however, sell a carbolic soap that will remove any stain at the cost of the skin beneath it, put in the vicar, as though anxious to contribute something unpastoral. My sexton swears by it. Your sexton, said Miss Clevenger dryly, swears by almost everything. Then let us, for a moment, imagine a lady with chemist mauve who does not ordinarily have Thursday liberty, said Whimsy. Yet today she has 5 minutes. She comes to the door, plants a sign of herself, and withdraws behind a trellis to observe. Perhaps to make sure Miss Clevenger does not sit, perhaps to ensure that someone else does. Mr. Blaggs, did you, in your detour, see whether the trellis affords a view of the door without being seen from the room? It do, said Mr. Blaggs. proud of the paradox. "Then we shall not accuse smoke," said Whimsy. He glanced once, more at the cup, at the mauve ring, at the solitary sugar succumbing with pathetic dignity. Somebody intends drama. Whether it is only of the parlour sort or of a darker stripe remains to be shown. "Bunter, you have the imprint?" "Good. We will take Miss Clevenger's punctuality and Mr. Blaggs's bells for our backbone. Now, Mrs. Vale, who else has been in and gone in the last quarter hour?" Mrs. Vale began, with the measured severity of a parish register, to enumerate the major and his rheumatism, the vicar and his glazing, 2 schoolboys with the moral complexion of treacle, Mr. Haskins with seed catalogues, Mrs. Featherstone's maid dispatched for cream, and a small woman with a veil who had not lifted it and had declined to sit. "A veil," said Whimsy, indolently interested. "Describe the veil." "Grey, cheap, the sort that gives you a headache if you wear it too long," said Mrs. Vale. "She asked if anyone had called for a parcel. I said no, and she went out again." "Between the bells?" asked Whimsy. "Between them," said Edna promptly. "Parcels," said Whimsy, and his eyes went back to the side passage, then to the shawl with its little secret pocket, then to Miss Clevenger's cup, where the milk floated on the surface like a treaty that hadn't yet been signed. "I think we shall presently discover that something did arrive, only not for the person who asked for it." And someone else arranged a chair to keep the room polite while she collected what was wanted impolitely. Miss Clevenger breathed out a small scorn. "Smuggling in, little Malling? We have only 4 vices, and smuggling is not one. Vices proliferate like geraniums when given a proper window," said Whimsy, smiling. "No, not smuggling. Something more domestic and therefore more dangerous. Let us walk about the village, Bunter. We will look in at the chemist's and inquire whether Mrs. Darnell believes in Thursdays. Mr. Blaggs, do not detain yourself with cream. Detain yourself with that trellis. If a person were to stand there and then to step 2 paces along, where would she arrive?" "The surgery gate," said Mr. Blaggs, eyes bright with geography. "And from there, the back of the reading room, where at 7 o'clock the village will assemble to hear how whispers carry," said Whimsy. "It would be excessively comic, would it not, if someone had been practicing the doctrine while the rest of us dined on scones?" He turned back to the cup and, with a final fastidious glance, nudged the saucer a fraction to the left. "Keep this as it is, Mrs. Vale. Pray do not let anybody tidy away the last cup. In a world determined to be reasonable, we must cling to our relics of unreason until they confess." And with that, he took up his hat, bowed to Miss Clevenger, who met him with a look that said she would tolerate anything but incompetence, and drifted out, Bunter following like a shadow that had learned discretion, leaving behind the shawl, the mauve, the sugar, and a room of respectable persons who had begun, uneasily and not without relish, to suspect themselves of living in a story. The lane outside the tea-room possessed that faintly guilty air common to English villages in late afternoon, when curtains twitch in advance of the evening and gossip prowls like a cat just out of sight. Lord Peter Whimsy, hands clasped behind his back and head tilted as though he were listening for music on some celestial gramophone, strolled toward the chemist's. Bunter matched his pace a step behind, the very image of quiet subservience, though his eyes, which missed less than microscopes, flicked from doorway to drain. "My lord," Bunter ventured, "the carbolic trace is distinct. One can smell it under the odor of scones." "Quite so, Bunter. The respectable stench of cleanliness. Carbolic is like theology. It is meant to purify, but it leaves one raw afterwards. The question is, why should a lady apply it with such enthusiasm upon her retreat from a tea-room, unless she had handled something she would rather not leave imprinted upon the world? Stains, Bunter, are the true Democrats. They stick to anyone." The chemist's shop, belonging to Mr. and Mrs. Darnell, presented its array of jars and bottles with the solemnity of a chapel. Behind the polished counter, Mrs. Darnell herself appeared, lips indeed painted in that unfortunate mauve which might have given Ovid material for a satire. She blinked at Whimsy's entrance as though confronted by a phenomenon, which in truth he was. "My dear madam," said Whimsy, bowing low enough to alarm a shelf of cough mixtures, "your establishment exudes the fragrance of virtue. I come, however, not for lineaments, but for enlightenment. Tell me, do you by any chance frequent Mrs. Vale's tea-room of a Thursday?" Mrs. Darnell's eyes narrowed. "Never. I work until 6. Everyone knows it." "Why?" "Merely that a cup today bore your distinguished shade of mauve, and rumour, being a frivolous jade, has already taken the liberty of assigning it to you." Her cheeks flushed with indignation. "I should hope, my lord, that I am not in the habit of abandoning cups like a barmaid. If a woman paints her mouth, must she be guilty of everything that bears its trace?" "Not everything," said Whimsy gravely, "only of that which others wish to believe. Forgive the inquiry. Perhaps you can reassure me that you have not, in the last hour, stepped so much as a foot beyond this counter." Mrs. Darnell straightened. "Not an inch. I have been here with my husband. Haven't I, Mr. Darnell?" A small man in spectacles appeared from the back room, reeking faintly of iodine. He nodded nervously. "Quite so. We had a delivery of carbolic soap, a large order." Mrs. Darnell checked the stock and signed for it. "Carbolic soap," said Whimsy softly. "Enough, perhaps, to leave its perfume lingering by the side yard of a tea-room." The chemist looked bewildered. "The boy may have cut through the yard on his way back. They're always in a hurry. I'm sorry if he disturbed anyone." Bunter's glance met Whimsy's. A trace, but not the whole tale. Whimsy leaned an elbow on the counter, smiling pleasantly. "I thank you. One cannot be too thorough. May I also inquire whether your good lady possesses a shawl of rayon?" Mrs. Darnell's eyes flashed. "Certainly not. I leave cheap fripperies to others." "Then I am doubly reassured," said Whimsy, bowing himself out. "Come, Bunter." We must not deprive Mrs. Darnell of her customers by monopolizing her charm. Once outside, Whimsy's air of languid amusement deepened into something more thoughtful. "There you have it, Bunter. A lady accused of a lipstick and instantly on the defensive. Not so much about the lipstick as about her station. The rayon shawl cuts deeper than the stain of mauve. Social snobbery is an admirable solvent. It strips away pretense with remarkable efficiency." They turned toward the reading room, a prim brick building with a notice board announcing tonight's lecture. Silence and sound, the architecture of hearing. A poster, slightly askew, depicted a pair of ears surrounded by concentric circles like ripples on water. Beneath it, a stack of wooden crates bore the chalk mark of the chemist's supplier. Whimsy crouched, examining the ground. "See here, Bunter." Damp footprints. The carbolics trace again. Someone paused here with a parcel. Note how the dust has smudged. She set it down to adjust something. Perhaps the shawl pocket. The ticket stub we found was no accident. It was meant to point us here. Now why should a lady go to such lengths to disguise her presence merely to fetch a parcel from behind the reading room? "A parcel, my lord, which may not have been soap," said Bunter quietly. "Precisely. And it is a curious thing, Bunter, how the respectable hide their most disreputable errands under the cloak of domesticity. No one suspects a woman fetching groceries or cream. One may smuggle anything in a sugar bag, even sin." They entered the reading room. The caretaker, a dry stick of a man named Rook, was arranging chairs with the painful exactitude of one who fears chairs may rebel if not kept in order. He looked up with mild surprise at the aristocratic intrusion. "Evening, my lord." "Come for the lecture?" "In due course," said Whimsy. "At present I am in pursuit of whispers. I understand, Mr. Rook, that a voice in your vestibule may be heard in the farthest corner, whereas the sermon in the parish hall is lost in the rafters." Rook chuckled. Aye, that's the joke. Sound carries queer in these walls. You'll hear the ladies behind the curtain clearer than the man on the platform. It's the arching. Acoustics, they call it. Mr. Pelling from the cities to explain it tonight. Whimsy ran a finger along the wall. So if a person wished to overhear or be overheard, she might contrive it here without appearing to do so. Likely enough, said Rook, unfazed. I've caught the children eavesdropping more than once. And today? Did you observe any lady loitering about? Not loitering. A veil, grey, came just before tea time, asked if a parcel had been left. I said no. She turned right sharp, like I'd offended her, and went off down the yard. Whimsy's eyes gleamed. Grey veil again, the elusive shade of anonymity. Thank you, Mr. Rook. You will be rewarded with my patronage at your lecture, which will doubtless confirm my conviction that whispering is the most underrated of crimes. As they stepped back into the lane, Bunter said softly, the veil conceals not merely a face, but a role. A woman who wishes to act without consequence must choose either a veil or a uniform. In this case, both might serve. My dear Bunter, you grow positively philosophical. Yes, the veil effaces individuality while hinting at secrecy. Whoever she is, she knows the village's habits well enough to orchestrate her absence like a conductor timing an overture. The bicycle bells, the scones, the charabanc horn, every sound in its place. It is all curiously theatrical. They walked back toward the green, where the evening shadows gathered. The tea room still glowed with its lace-curtained lights, but the atmosphere had altered. People leaned together in groups, whispering that first intoxicating mixture of fear and self-importance that arises when a mystery takes root in the soil of habit. Whimsy observed them with gentle mockery. Look at them, Bunter. Already every villager suspects every other. Suspicion is the most democratic of passions. It requires no education and little imagination. Within an hour, they will have hanged poor Miss Clevenger in the public mind and absolved themselves of all sin. But the truth, I suspect, lies not in her punctuality, but in her absence, and the manner of its arrangement. Bunter inclined his head. Do you think, my lord, that we are dealing with crime? Whimsy smiled faintly. Crime is only the vulgar label. What we are dealing with, Bunter, is intent. Intent is far more amusing. Someone has engineered an appearance to conceal an errand. Whether that errand was theft, blackmail, or only a romantic assignation gone awry remains to be seen. But the carbolic lingers, and carbolic never attends romance. As the church clock struck 5, a sudden commotion arose near the green. A boy came running, breathless, shouting that Dr. Redpath had been called to the millhouse. A woman had collapsed in the lane behind it, face veiled, shawl discarded, hands red raw as though scrubbed with acid. Whimsy and Bunter exchanged one glance. Without haste, but with that peculiar urgency of the man who knows that truth must be caught before it evaporates, Whimsy turned toward the millhouse. The lane twisted between hedges, the light dimming into that uncanny half-gloom that makes even familiar shapes sinister. At the end lay the figure of a woman, grey veil askew, her lips cracked and pallid beneath the streaks of mauve that clung despite her efforts to erase them. The rayon shawl lay beside her like a discarded alibi. She's breathing, muttered the doctor, bent over her, but weak. Some corrosive on the hands, burnt near raw. Looks as if she tried to wash something away in a hurry. Whimsy crouched, studying the face beneath the veil. It was not Miss Clevenger, nor was it Mrs. Darnell. It was someone plainer, someone anonymous, yet the traces of paint betrayed that she had dressed herself to resemble another. A stand-in, a decoy. Bunter, Whimsy murmured. Observe. The counterfeit cup required a counterfeit woman, and the counterfeit has failed. But what, in heaven's name, was she carrying that demanded carbolic in disguise? The woman stirred, muttering a single incoherent phrase. Not for me, before lapsing again into silence. The villagers gathered at the lane's mouth, murmuring like a tide. Whimsy rose, brushing the dust from his trousers. His face, which had been light with amusement, was now shadowed by something colder, sharper. The play grows darker, Bunter. We have moved from the comedy of manners to the tragedy of intention. Tonight's lecture will be a performance worth attending. I fancy our whispering lady had business there, and someone else has business with her silence. They carried the woman into the millhouse, where she lay insensible. Outside, the sky dulled into pewter, and the first bell of evening tolled, a sound that lingered unnaturally, carrying further than bells ought to carry, as though the village itself conspired to remind its inhabitants that every word, every whisper, might be heard by someone. Whimsy, standing in the doorway, listened intently to the fading resonance. Yes, Bunter. Acoustics indeed. The village has begun to speak. The question is whether we are clever enough to hear what it says before someone else falls silent, permanently. The millhouse parlor had never before entertained so many people at once. Its faded rugs and dark beams, which usually presided over quiet accounts and the occasional parish meeting, were suddenly occupied by half the village, their faces pale in the twilight, and their voices pitched to that strained whisper which means, paradoxically, that everyone wishes to be overheard. The unconscious woman lay upon a horsehair sofa, her grey veil pulled back, her hands swathed in linen hastily bound by Dr. Redpath. The acrid tang of carbolic clung to her like an accusation. Whimsy stood near the hearth, posture easy but eyes bright. He twirled his monocle by its cord with the air of a man passing the time before dinner, yet his mind, restless and merciless, had already begun to assemble fragments into the outline of something unpleasant. Bunter, silent as the shadow of a servant ought to be, hovered just out of earshot of the villagers, but well within his master's line of command. Miss Clevenger, rigid and precise, sat bolt upright on a chair borrowed from the kitchen, her expression hovering between distaste and satisfaction. "I said from the beginning," she remarked to Mrs. Vale, "that Rayon was not to be trusted. And here we are." "Rayon leads inevitably to ruin, not Rayon," murmured Whimsy, almost to himself, "but the ruin of intention." The doctor straightened from his patient with a sigh. "She'll live. Hands badly burned, lungs irritated. She's inhaled something." She muttered about washing, about scrubbing. I can't imagine what she thought to erase with such violence. "A conscience, perhaps," offered the vicar, whose spectacles had slipped again to their perilous brink. "No," said Whimsy, softly but firmly. "Conscience does not dissolve in carbolic. It only smells as though it might. Tell me, doctor, does Our Lady of the Vale bear any marks, rings, scars, distinguishing features?" "None," said Redpath. "She's unremarkable. That, perhaps, is most remarkable of all. A face one forgets the instant it leaves the room." "Ah," said Whimsy, his voice laced with irony, "the perfect material for a decoy. One can paint her, veil her, dress her in rayon, and she becomes whomever one wishes. Yet when the paint cracks and the veil slips, no one remembers her at all." The villagers murmured uneasily. Whimsy turned, allowing his gaze to drift from face to face until it rested, with feigned idleness, upon Mrs. Darnell, who stood stiff as a column, her mauve lips pressed thin. "Tell me, Mrs. Darnell," he said, "do you employ an assistant at the chemist's shop?" "A girl, sometimes, for errands," she said too quickly. "Plain sort." "One forgets her name." "Precisely," said Whimsy. "One forgets her name because it is useful that one should. And when the errand is more delicate than a parcel of soap, one sends the girl with a shawl, a veil, a smear of borrowed lipstick, and a strict instruction to be seen but not recognized. It is ingenious, really." One almost applauds. Mrs. Darnell flushed crimson, but her husband made a small protesting gesture. "We send parcels, yes, but only soap, never anything improper. My wife would not risk— Risk, interrupted Whimsy gently, is the very currency of concealment. One does not need to smuggle jewels or poisons. One need only smuggle appearances. A cup in a tea room, a shawl folded, a lady who is not a lady, and an absence neatly staged. That is risk enough. The constable, Mr. Blaggs, cleared his throat with official significance. Begging your pardon, my lord, but if we're saying Mrs. Darnell set this up, shouldn't I— No, said Whimsy, smiling. Not yet. If you detain people before their drama has concluded, they grow peevish and refuse to perform the final act. Let us allow our play to proceed. I suspect tonight's lecture will provide us with a performance of a different order. The villagers shifted, unsettled. Mrs. Vale muttered that her tea room would never recover its reputation. Miss Clevenger sniffed that it had none to lose. And through it all, the unconscious woman breathed shallowly, her bandaged hands twitching as though even in sleep she tried to scrub away some invisible stain. At length, Whimsy moved toward the door. Come, Bunter. We must secure our seats for Mr. Pelling's sermon on acoustics. It is not every day that a village instructs us in how whispers carry. The reading room was already filling when they arrived. Chairs scraped, programs rustled, and the respectable faces of little Malling arranged themselves into masks of earnest attention. At the front stood Mr. Pelling, a lecturer of the pedantic breed, whose spectacles magnified his eyes until they seemed permanently astonished by his own intelligence. Behind him, the poster of concentric circles flapped faintly in the draught. Whimsy and Bunter slipped in unobtrusively, though half the room craned necks to watch them. The news of the grey-veiled woman had already spread. Everyone wanted to know what Lord Peter would say. He said nothing. He merely folded his long figure into a chair, adjusted his monocle, and allowed the lecturer's drone about echoes and reverberation to wash over him like a tide of irrelevancy. But he listened, not to the words, but to the way they carried. From his seat near the aisle he could hear, faint and distinct, the whisper of two girls at the back remarking on his tie. He could hear the scrape of a pencil in the front row louder than Pelling's carefully projected phrases. It was, indeed, a room built for secrets disguised as accidents. Halfway through the lecture, as Pelling extolled the way a building's design might betray its occupants into unintended confession, Whimsy leaned sideways to Bunter and murmured, "Observe how the whisper carries." Our veiled lady chose her stage well. She meant to hear or to be heard. In just such a fashion, Bunter inclined his head, eyes scanning the room. Near the back, Mrs. Darnell sat rigid, her hands clenched on her lap. Next to her, the vicar fidgeted, clearly struggling between interest in acoustics and discomfort at proximity to scandal. And in the far corner, half hidden behind the trellis of chairs, a figure in another veil, dark this time, watched the platform intently. Whimsy's eyes gleamed. A second veil, Bunter. Either the first has multiplied, or we are witnessing a conspiracy of anonymity. The lecture droned to its conclusion amid polite applause. Pelling beamed, satisfied with his captive audience, and invited questions. The villagers, too proper to challenge, sat in silence. Whimsy rose, elegant and faintly mocking. "If I may," he said, "it strikes me that your excellent discourse has a certain bearing upon our domestic affairs. For instance, if a person wished to overhear a promise whispered in the vestibule, could she do so from here without being seen?" Pelling puffed out his chest. "Certainly, my lord. The architecture ensures it. A whisper here will travel clear as a bell there." "Just so," said Whimsy. "Then it is possible that what was spoken in confidence behind a curtain might reach ears for which it was not intended." "Unquestionably." The villagers shifted, whispers rising in confirmation of the truth. Whimsy smiled faintly and sat. His point was made. Secrets had been spoken. Someone had heard. The question was who. As the crowd began to disperse, Whimsy lingered. He drifted toward the vestibule, where the air carried not merely whispers, but a residue of scent. The faint, acrid tang of carbolic again, overlaid now with something more delicate. Lavender. He bent, as though inspecting a loose tile, and lifted from the floor a scrap of paper. It was damp, smudged, but legible. "Meet me by the trellis at 4:30. Do not fail." He slipped it into his pocket, straightened, and remarked, to no one in particular, "Trellises, Bunter, are becoming excessively popular. They conceal, they reveal, and they bear witness to the most inconvenient promises." Bunter, impassive, nodded. "Shall I preserve it, my lord?" "Indeed. We collect relics of absence, Bunter, until they form a presence too solid to be denied. This little note, the shawl, the mauve stain, they are the beads of a rosary. When counted, they will name the sinner." Outside, the night deepened. Lamps glowed in cottage windows, casting elongated shadows upon the lanes. Whimsy walked slowly toward the green, his mind alive with fragments. A counterfeit woman, a folded shawl, a cup of tea never drunk, a note summoning someone to the trellis, and an unconscious girl with carbolic-scarred hands. It was, in its way, a perfect problem. Theatrical, domestic, absurd, and sinister, all at once. "Bunter," he said at last, pausing beneath the lamplight, "do you know what it is that pleases me most about these rural dramas?" "My lord?" "The way they begin in farce. A cup, a shawl, a shade of mauve, and end in tragedy. Comedy is always the rehearsal. Tragedy is the final act, and our curtain, I think, has not yet risen." He glanced back toward the reading room, where a few stragglers still lingered, whispering in tones more easily carried than they knew. Somewhere among them lay the truth, concealed in a voice, a glance, or a silence too carefully arranged. And Whimsy, monocle glinting, smiled like a man who had already heard the whisper and was merely waiting for the room to realize it had spoken. The village green lay hushed after the lecture, its lamps shining with the faintly embarrassed glow of places that have overheard more than they ought. Whimsy and Bunter took the long way round past the churchyard, their footfalls soft against the gravel. The evening air held the chill of damp stone and the sweet, sour tang of wood smoke. From the inn came a chorus of rustic laughter that jarred curiously with the subdued whispers filtering from cottage to cottage. Whimsy hummed a few bars of a madrigal, stopped abruptly, and said, "Bunter, do you know what amuses me?" The English capacity for treating a whiff of scandal as if it were a draught under the door. Everybody feels it, nobody shuts the door, and all the while the house grows colder. "Yes, my lord," said Bunter without changing stride. They reached the millhouse once more, where the veiled woman still lay under the doctor's care. A lamp glowed in the parlor window, and the murmur of voices drifted out. Constable Blaggs emerged, tugging at his cap. "She's come round, my lord," he said, "but weak and wild with it. Keeps saying it wasn't hers." "Not mine," she says. Doctors keeping her quiet. "Not hers," murmured Whimsy. "Possession denied is often possession betrayed. Let us see if denial has a more eloquent twin." Inside, the room was thick with the smell of embrocation and damp linen. The woman stirred faintly on the sofa, her hands swaddled, her eyes glassy. Dr. Redpath looked up. 10 minutes, no more. She's exhausted. Whimsy inclined his head and knelt beside her, his tone suddenly gentle as one coaxing a child. "You have been most obliging, my dear. You stood in for another, did you not? Put on a shawl, a veil, a colour not your own, and now you are burnt for your pains. Tell me, who asked it of you?" Her lips moved. The words came halting, fractured by breath. "Not hers. Said, just take it. Leave it. Not mine." Whimsy leaned closer. "Who said so? Mrs. Darnell? Or another? Her eyes flickered in confusion. She paid 2 shillings. Said quick, "No one see parcel?" Then she turned her head sharply away, as though refusing the memory, and sank once more into exhaustion. Whimsy rose, thoughtful. A decoy indeed. Paid for her trouble, sent to plant the shawl, to order the tea, to vanish in a cloud of mauve. And the parcel? That, Bunter, is the star actor who has not yet taken the stage. Bunter's voice was low. "Shall I inquire, my lord, among the delivery boys?" A parcel sent by chemist or grocer might easily be traced. In due course, yes. But I fancy our drama has a subtler spine. The parcel was not meant to vanish into her hands, but into someone else's. She was the veil, the distraction. Behind her absence, another presence slipped by. The doctor fussed with his patient. Miss Clevenger, who had stationed herself in a corner with the air of one safeguarding the moral fabric of England, announced, "This is all very irregular. We shall have the newspapers sniffing about. I cannot allow my name to be dragged through mauve scandal." Whimsy bowed. "No one would dare, madam. You are far too punctual to be scandalous. But tell me, whom did you expect to meet at the tea-room today?" "I expect no one," she snapped. "I go for refreshment, not intrigue." "Refreshment can be had at home," said Whimsy smoothly. "Tea-rooms are for intrigue. That is why they have lace curtains. Did you receive by chance a note bidding you to the trellis?" Her expression faltered, just for a breath. "Nonsense. Notes are for schoolgirls. I require no such frivolity." Whimsy's smile deepened. "Quite so. Then if one were found, addressed obliquely, you would disavow it with dignity." "Admirable." He left her bristling and stepped back into the night. Bunter followed, carrying the shawl carefully wrapped. The constable hovered uncertainly. "My lord, do you mean to say we've a crime on our hands? Shall I fetch the inspector from Upchurch?" "Not yet, Mr. Blaggs. We have an intrigue, which is quite another thing. If we invite inspectors too soon, they clutter the stage with clanking boots. Let us instead discover what role the parcel played. Who sent it, who received it, who scrubbed it into invisibility." They walked back toward the chemist's, now shuttered for the night. The street was almost deserted, save for a solitary figure moving quickly in the opposite direction. Whimsy paused, head tilted. "That, Bunter, is Mrs. Darnell. Note how swiftly she walks, as though pursued by whispers. Let us follow at a respectable distance. We may learn where her conscience lodges Mrs. Darnell's figure." Dark against the lamplight, turned down a narrow passage toward the reading-room yard. She paused at the trellis, bent briefly, and then moved on toward the church path. Whimsy approached the trellis after she had gone. Bunter's lantern discreetly shaded. A faint mark in the dirt caught his eye, an oblong impression recently made, about the size of a small box. Beside it, a smear of damp earth that smelled unmistakably of carbolic. "Here it is, Bunter," he murmured. The parcel was left, collected, and erased. Only the earth remembers. What was in it? Something small, important, not to be seen in daylight. And why the elaborate charade with shawls and veils? Because the true recipient could not be seen to collect it. Bunter bent, his keen eyes narrowing. "A scrap of paper, my lord." He lifted it delicately with forceps. It was a torn fragment of wrapping, stamped faintly with the chemist's mark and smudged with mauve at one corner. "Soap?" asked Bunter. "Perhaps," said Whimsy. Or perhaps soap was the costume in which something less innocent disguised itself. Imagine, Bunter, a bottle of something volatile, a powder that stains, a draught that silences. Carbolic might remove the trace, but it cannot erase the intention, and our unconscious girl was made the scapegoat of that intention. The church clock struck the half-hour. Whimsy straightened, brushing dust from his trousers. Tomorrow we shall interview Mr. Darnell himself. He's a small man with a nervous conscience, which makes him either the dupe or the puppet master. Either way, he will quiver into speech. Meanwhile, we watch. For I suspect the play has one more rehearsal before its premiere. As they turned toward the inn, a figure detached itself from the shadows and hurried past. A man in clerical collar, face pale in the lamplight. The vicar, walking with unusual haste, clutching something hidden in his coat. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "Ah, Bunter, a new understudy enters the drama. Our village stage grows crowded, but which of them holds the script? That, my dear fellow, we must discover before the curtain rises on something less theatrical and more fatal." They stood for a moment in the quiet square, the lamplight flickering, the whispers of villagers leaking through thin walls. Somewhere a door slammed, sharp as a pistol shot. Whimsy tilted his head, listening as though the sound itself carried a confession. "Voices travel curiously here," he said. "One whispers, another hears. The carbolic clings, and sooner or later, Bunter, the truth will speak whether it wishes or not." And with that, they walked on into the waiting night, two solitary figures moving through the village that had already begun, unknowingly, to betray its secrets. The next morning rose grey and chill, with a mist that seemed reluctant to lift from the hedgerows. Little Malling wore its secrecy like a cloak. The tea-room shutters remained closed longer than usual, though Mrs. Vale could be glimpsed inside, rearranging teapots with a ferocity that suggested nothing less than a full-scale assault upon her establishment's tarnished respectability. Across the square, the chemist's shop displayed its usual jars of lozenges and tonics, but its door stayed bolted until well after 9, a sure sign that all was not quite right in the Darnell household. Lord Peter Whimsy, however, appeared to be untroubled by the atmosphere. He emerged from the inn at breakfast time with Bunter in attendance, his monocle glittering as he examined the mist as though it were an exotic import. "A picturesque fog, Bunter," he remarked, "the sort that lends itself to melodrama. One might expect a veiled lady to glide out of it bearing incriminating parcels, or an avenger with a dagger to drift through it like a stage effect. Alas, I expect only Bacon Bunter, who had already contrived to secure bacon of the most respectable sort, refrained from comment. Over breakfast, Whimsy spread out the fragments of the previous day's puzzle. The mauve rim on the cup, the rayon shawl with its hidden pocket, the parcel's smudged wrapping, and the whispered note promising a rendezvous at the trellis. He tapped each relic with a long finger. "The difficulty, Bunter, lies not in discovering what was done, but in discerning why. A counterfeit patron was created in the tea-room. The decoy established the illusion of presence, then vanished, leaving the place reserved, as it were, for Miss Clevenger's habitual hour. Meanwhile, a parcel was collected from the trellis. Our decoy collapsed, her part played, her hands burnt by some corrosive, evidence of hasty destruction. That much is plain. What is not plain is the motive. Why disguise a simple errand? Why stage a drama that could have been carried out in discreet silence?" Bunter laid out a neatly labeled envelope. Inside was the paper scrap found near the trellis. "One might suspect, my lord, that the contents of the parcel were of such a nature as could not survive the daylight scrutiny of this respectable village. Indeed, contraband of a domestic stripe, not smuggled tobacco, nor brandy, nor foreign laces. No, something more sinisterly banal. A draught, a powder, a chemical, something that burns if one tries to erase it. And who, Bunter, traffics most naturally in such things? Why, our chemist and his wife, with their respectable jars and tinctures, and yet the veil falls not only over their shop, but over the vicar, who prowled last night with unusual haste. Why should a man of the cloth keep company with secrecy? When they at last crossed to the chemist's shop, the bell gave a querulous jangle. Mr. Darnell appeared from behind the counter, pale, spectacles askew, and hands trembling faintly. His wife was nowhere to be seen. "Ah, Mr. Darnell," said Whimsy with exaggerated cheerfulness. "I was most anxious to purchase soap." Nothing soothed the conscience like a fresh bar of carbolic. Mr. Darnell winced as though struck. "Soap, my lord?" "Certainly. We have it in good supply." Whimsy leaned casually on the counter, his gaze sharpening. "And yet yesterday, a parcel bearing your mark was discovered near the reading room, its wrapper smudged with mauve. A triviality, perhaps. But the young woman who carried it now lies half dead with her hands scorched raw. Curious, is it not, that soap should leave such wounds?" The chemist fumbled at his spectacles. I don't know what you mean. My wife deals with customers. I handle only the accounts." "Ah," said Whimsy. "The oldest division of labor. One takes the credit, the other the blame. But tell me, Mr. Darnell, what precisely was in that parcel? Do not trouble yourself to invent. Truth, like carbolic, has a way of seeping through." Darnell looked about as though for escape. "It was a tonic," he whispered at last. "Something ordered privately. For the vicar. He said it must be discreet. My wife, she made the arrangement. I swear I knew nothing more." "The vicar," murmured Whimsy, filing it neatly away. "Discretion, of course. But why should discretion burn the hands to the bone?" Before Darnell could answer, Mrs. Darnell herself swept in through the side door, her lips painted more fiercely mauve than ever. "My husband," she said coldly, "is not well. He cannot be expected to account for village gossip. Whatever you have heard, Lord Peter, it has nothing to do with us." "On the contrary," said Whimsy, his voice now silken, "it has everything to do with you. A decoy paid from your purse, a shawl folded to keep a place not yours, a parcel wrapped with your mark, and carbolic, which no veil can conceal. If these are trifles, madam, they are remarkably consistent trifles." Her eyes blazed. "If there has been trickery, it was none of my making. I serve my customers. If the vicar asked for privacy, I gave it him. If a girl ran errands, she did so of her own accord. Do not dare to suggest otherwise." Whimsy bowed slightly. "Then perhaps you will not object if I call upon the vicar this morning, to relieve you of all suspicion?" Mrs. Darnell's lips parted, then closed again, leaving only the mauve outline like a seal upon her silence. They left her thus, the chemist hunched in his shadow, and his wife standing rigid as an idol of respectability. On the street, Whimsy let out a low whistle. "Ah, Bunter, there it is. Guilt may be denied, but fear betrays itself." The good lady turned pale at the name of her own accomplice. The vicarage, when they reached it, offered an appearance of tranquility, roses climbing dutifully up the trellis, the sound of hens in the yard, the front door freshly painted. But when the maid showed them into the study, the vicar himself rose with a start, his spectacles fogged, his hands clutching the edge of the desk as though he had been caught in prayer of an unusually material sort. "My lord," he stammered, "a pleasure, an honor. To what do I owe?" Whimsy waved it aside. "Merely a curiosity, Reverend Sir. I am told you received a tonic from the chemist yesterday, delivered privately, without your name attached. How interesting that secrecy should be so fashionable." The vicar flushed to the roots of his thinning hair. "It was a restorative, nothing more. I suffer from nerves, you see. The parish hall acoustics, the children, the incessant business. I did not wish the parish to gossip, a laudable instinct," said Whimsy. "And yet the parcel appears to have scorched the hands of an innocent messenger. Tell me, what sort of tonic burns like acid?" The vicar gaped. "Burns? Impossible. I never even received it. Mrs. Darnell was to send it, but it never came. I swear I know nothing of carbolic or burns. I only asked for something to quiet me." Whimsy studied him. The man's confusion seemed genuine. His tremor was not feigned. He was guilty of cowardice, perhaps, but not of orchestration. "Then someone intercepted your tonic," he said softly, and disguised the theft in the folds of rayon and the smear of mauve. Remarkable. As they left the vicarage, Whimsy stood in the lane, staring toward the mist-veiled reading room. So, Bunter, a parcel meant for the vicar, never delivered, a decoy burnt, discarded, a chemist's wife who arranges with precision and denies with passion, and somewhere, in the background, a hand that profits from both absence and silence, Bunter ventured. The motive, my lord. Not money, I think. Not yet. Rather influence. To hold something over the vicar, to make him complicit, to silence him with the threat of exposure. What better lever in a village than the weakness of its clergymen? But who pulls that lever? That is our task. They walked back toward the inn as the mist began to thin. The villagers, already abroad, eyed them with furtive curiosity. Whimsy lifted his hat cheerfully as though all were holiday, but his eyes were narrowed with thought. The plot thickens, Bunter, he murmured, and like a good custard, if one stirs too early, it collapses. We must wait until it sets. Tonight, perhaps, when whispers travel furthest, we shall hear the truth. And as the church bell tolled the hour, its sound carrying clear and strange across the green, Whimsy smiled faintly, for the village itself seemed to be whispering back, carrying secrets on its peculiar acoustics. Secrets that he, and only he, intended to hear. The fog had lifted by evening, leaving little Malling washed in a pale gold light that made its cottages look innocently picturesque, as though the place had never whispered a secret in its life. But Whimsy, strolling along the lane with his stick tapping the stones in idle counterpoint to his thoughts, knew better. Villages, he often said, were like well-swept parlors, neat on the surface, but concealing a fine film of dust one could write a scandal in with the merest fingertip. At the inn, the landlord had saved him a place by the window overlooking the square. From there he could see Mrs. Vale's tea-room, lamps glowing again as if in defiance of yesterday's excitement, and the chemist's shop, shuttered early as though virtue were best preserved by absence. Whimsy ate his supper with every appearance of unconcern, humming a fragment of Purcell, but his eyes strayed often to the street outside. Bunter, unflappable as ever, brought him a folded scrap of paper. "From the maid at the vicarage, my lord." She asked if I would pass it on discreetly. She seemed anxious. Whimsy unfolded the note. The handwriting was nervous but legible. He did not order any tonic. They made him say so. "Please come after dark, by the churchyard gate." "Ha!" Whimsy's monocle glinted. "Our reverend shepherd may bleat of nerves, but it seems the flock knows better. A maid who risks a note in her employer's house is either a fool or a witness. I fancy the latter. After dark, then, Bunter. In the meantime, let us attend the tea-room. Our relic of the last cup may yet preserve a whisper or two." The tea-room was quieter that evening. A handful of customers lingered, speaking in lowered tones. Mrs. Vale greeted Whimsy with a mixture of pride and apprehension, for his presence was at once an honor and a threat to respectability. The corner table still bore its associations, though cleared of the incriminating. Cup, it seemed marked, as if scandal had seeped into the wood grain. "Business is dreadful, my lord," Mrs. Vale lamented, polishing an urn with unnecessary vigor. "People come not for tea, but to peer and whisper." "It's indecent. Whispering," said Whimsy gravely, "is the most decent of indecencies. It allows us to sin without raising our voices. Tell me, has Mrs. Darnell called again?" Mrs. Vale's lips pinched. She swept in this afternoon, demanding to know who had been seated at Miss Clevenger's table. As if it mattered. She said her name must not be spoken in connection with veils and shawls. I told her we are not in the habit of discussing our betters behind their backs. "Excellent," said Whimsy. "The surest way to ensure a name is spoken everywhere is to forbid its mention." "She's writing her own libel. Mrs. Vale, Miss Clevenger herself, was there," seated in her usual place, sipping her china tea with the air of a martyr vindicated. She gave Whimsy a cool nod. "You see, Lord Peter, I am punctual as always." "One must demonstrate consistency when others indulge in melodrama. Consistency," said Whimsy, "is admirable in clocks and women. Yet sometimes both are adjusted." Her eyes narrowed. "Do you suggest I am adjustable?" "Merely observed that punctuality can be the most eloquent disguise of all," he replied lightly, before turning away to examine the lace curtains as though they held the solution to human folly. When they left, the dusk had deepened into true night. The village square was almost deserted. Only the lamplighter moved about, his pole raising a series of small suns into the gloom. The churchyard loomed at the end of the lane, its yews like silent sentinel. By the gate stood a girl in a plain cap and cloak, nervous, twisting her hands in her apron. "You wrote this note?" Whimsy asked gently. "Yes, my lord." I had to. It isn't right. They're forcing him. Speak plainly, child." "Who is forcing whom?" "Mrs. Darnell," she whispered. "She and her husband." "They came last week. Said the vicar must order a tonic, a private tonic, for his nerves. He refused at first, said he needed nothing of the kind. Then she spoke to him again, quiet-like, and he grew pale and said very well. She gave him words to say so people wouldn't ask questions, but he never wanted it. He's frightened of exposure," murmured Whimsy. "And what leverage does Mrs. Darnell possess that the cloth should tremble before her?" The girl's eyes darted toward the churchyard. "Something to do with letters. Old letters. She said if he didn't do as she asked, she'd show them. He went white as a sheet. I don't know what's in them, but he begged her not to. That's why she used the parcel. Only it went wrong with that poor girl." She broke off, clutching her apron. "Thank you," said Whimsy kindly. "You have done your duty. Leave the rest to me. Silence, my dear, is sometimes more dangerous than speech. You are safer for having spoken." She hurried away, vanishing into the lanes. Whimsy remained a moment beneath the yews, thoughtful. "Letters, Bunter. Always letters. They are the skeleton keys of scandal. The vicar quails, the chemist's wife commands, and a decoy collapses in the lane. What did those letters contain? A foolish, youthful indiscretion? A debt? A liaison? Whatever their nature, they serve as shackles. But one wonders, who placed them in Mrs. Darnell's hands?" Bunter said quietly. "It seems unlikely she stumbled upon them by chance, my lord." "Precisely. Someone supplied them, someone who stands to gain from the vicar's silence. The question is whether that someone resides in his own household or beyond." They returned to the inn, but Whimsy did not sleep. Instead, he paced his room, cigarette smoke curling upward like ghostly punctuation. From time to time, he paused at the window, listening to the night sounds. A cartwheel echoing along the lane, a dog barking, the distant toll of the church clock. Each sound seemed to him a clue in the curious architecture of hearing. Toward midnight, he roused Bunter. "Come, my dear fellow. Let us walk to the reading room. I've a fancy that our trellis has not yet spoken its last." The village lay silent. They moved like wraiths past shuttered houses until the reading room loomed, its windows dark. At the trellis, Whimsy paused, bending to examine the ground. The earth bore fresh marks, not the oblong of a parcel, but the prints of shoes, small and neat, pacing back and forth. "See, Bunter? Someone waited here tonight, expecting a meeting. When none came, they left." Impatience writes itself in footsteps. Something white caught his eye among the weeds. He stooped and retrieved a folded envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank but for a smear of mauve at one corner. "A signal," Whimsy murmured, "left here for the wrong hands or the right ones. Someone was meant to collect, someone else to interpret. And once more, mauve signs the document." Our chemist's wife is untidy with her accomplices. They lingered in the shadow of the building, waiting. The night held its breath. At last, a figure approached, cautious, wrapped in a cloak. It was the vicar. He halted by the trellis, looked about desperately, then knelt as though searching. When he found nothing, he covered his face with his hands. Whimsy stepped forward, gentle but inexorable. "Looking for a message, Reverend Sir? Or seeking to hide one?" The vicar started violently. "My lord, I was merely walking." "Walking in circles around a trellis at midnight," said Whimsy dryly. "A common recreation, no doubt, but unconvincing. Confess, you expected a letter. Perhaps the return of one long vanished, perhaps assurance that silence still holds." The vicar swayed. "You cannot understand those letters. If they were known, my parish, my position, precisely why you are useful to whoever holds them," said Whimsy softly. "But take courage, sir. Blackmail is a parasite. Expose it to light and it perishes. Hide it and it feeds until it consumes." The poor man covered his face again, unable to answer. Whimsy touched his arm lightly. "Go home. Rest. Tomorrow we shall bring this charade into daylight, where it belongs." When the vicar had gone, Whimsy turned to Bunter. His tone was sharper now, the mask of indolence slipping. "It is as I thought. Blackmail, Bunter, thinly veiled in rayon and mauve. But whose hand guided Mrs. Darnell? She is a tool, not the architect. The true author of this drama remains unseen." Bunter regarded him steadily. "Do you expect him, or her, to reveal themselves tomorrow, my lord?" Whimsy smiled faintly. "My dear fellow, they have already revealed themselves. They only do not yet realize it. Tomorrow we shall arrange a little acoustical demonstration of our own. Let the village hear what it has pretended not to. Then the silence will collapse beneath the weight of its own echo, and with that he strode back into the sleeping village, a faint glimmer of amusement and steel in his eyes, as though he were already listening to the last whispered confession carried across the strange acoustics of Little Malling. Morning broke with deceptive clarity, a pale sun polishing the rooftops of Little Malling until the cottages looked as guiltless as hymn books. Yet Whimsy, gazing out from the inn window, knew better. He had always maintained that nothing was so treacherous as an English morning. It promised innocence while concealing the sins of the previous night under the respectable cover of fresh light. He dressed without haste, humming a madrigal again, and breakfasted sparingly, his attention less on eggs than on the plan forming in his mind. By 9 o'clock, he had dispatched Bunter with quiet instructions, which Bunter received with his usual wordless efficiency, vanishing into the lanes as though he were part of the mist itself. Whimsy then strolled, cane swinging, toward the green, where already the villagers loitered, pretending to admire shop windows but clearly hungry for developments. Mrs. Vale emerged from the tea-room in a formidable bonnet, broom in hand, sweeping her threshold as though it were sin itself. She gave Whimsy a sharp nod. "Morning, my lord. You'll be glad to hear no suspicious shawls have been folded on my premises today." "Alas," said Whimsy cheerfully, "a day without shawls is a day without poetry. Yet perhaps you will have compensation in the form of melodrama before nightfall." Miss Clevenger came striding across the green at that moment, spine stiff as a poker. "I trust," she said acidly, "that this village will soon be purged of theatricality. One cannot drink tea without being cast in somebody else's farce." "Farce, dear lady," Whimsy replied, "is only tragedy rehearsing its lines." She sniffed and passed on, but her eyes flicked toward the chemist's shop with unmistakable tension. Whimsy noted it, storing the glance away like a coin in a pocket. The shop itself opened late again, Mrs. Darnell appearing behind the counter with lips painted the habitual mauve, though her smile looked carved from iron. She greeted Whimsy with a studied composure. May I serve you, my lord? Or are you only here to inspect my stock for scandal? Neither, he said smoothly. I am here to invite you and your husband to a small gathering this afternoon in the reading room. A demonstration, one might say, of Mr. Pelling's principles of acoustics. I think the village will find it instructive. Her composure faltered, just a flicker, but she inclined her head. If the village is to be edified, I can hardly refuse. From the back room came Mr. Darnell's pale face, startled, rabbit-like. He blinked and vanished again. Whimsy left with a bow, his expression one of polite unconcern, though his thoughts had quickened. By mid-afternoon, the reading room was again full, villagers drawn by curiosity as moths by a candle. They whispered and speculated, eyeing Whimsy as though he were both conjurer and hangman. At the front, Whimsy arranged a few chairs and papers with deliberate casualness. The vicar sat near the front, visibly trembling, while Miss Clevenger took her usual uncompromising posture, and Mrs. Vale beamed grim disapproval from a central seat. Mrs. Darnell swept in, her mauve lips taut, her husband trailing behind like a shadow that wished to vanish. Whimsy tapped his cane against the floor, and the room hushed. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard last night the excellent lecture upon acoustics, which proved that a whisper in one corner may carry to another with uncomfortable clarity. Permit me to illustrate. He nodded toward Bunter, who had stationed himself discreetly near the vestibule. Bunter bent and whispered. Instantly, as if conjured, his words echoed clear to the back. Meet me by the trellis at 4:30. Do not fail, the villagers started. A murmur rippled through the hall. Whimsy raised a hand. That, you will observe, was the note left for collection yesterday. A note not written by Miss Clevenger, nor by the vicar, but by another hand. A hand that could not resist signing its work with a smear of mauve. He lifted the folded scrap, sealed in an envelope, and held it delicately. All eyes turned toward Mrs. Darnell. Her face remained composed, but a tiny pulse flickered at her temple. Why such elaborate theatre? Whimsy continued. Because a parcel was to be passed unseen, a parcel disguised in soap but containing something less innocent. It was to be collected by a decoy, an expendable girl painted and veiled to resemble another, while the true recipient lingered in the shadows. The decoy fell, her hands burnt, but the plot remained. The vicar gave a strangled cry. Whimsy looked at him gently. Yes, Reverend Sir, the parcel was in your name. But you were only the lever, not the fulcrum. Letters, old imprudent letters, were used to force your compliance. They were placed in Mrs. Darnell's keeping to make her mistress of silence. But she is not the architect. She is merely the loudest whisper, the villagers gasped. Mrs. Darnell half rose, then sat again, her lips parting soundlessly. The true author, said Whimsy, his voice quiet now, compelling, is the one who profits from both your silence and hers. Consider who had access to those letters, who in fact first whispered of the vicar's indiscretion long ago, then tucked it away as if forgotten. Who speaks always of punctuality, of consistency, of respectability, yet arrives yesterday 12 minutes late, leaving the stage for another to perform her part. All eyes swung to Miss Clevenger. She sat rigid, her face frozen, the teacup in her hand rattling against its saucer. Yes, said Whimsy, almost tenderly. You, Miss Clevenger? You who arrive on Thursdays at 4, regular as the post, to watch the charabanc and sneer at its vulgarity. But yesterday you arranged to be late. Just late enough that the decoy could take your place, order your tea, fold a shawl in your stead. While the village believed you absent, you moved unseen to collect what was left at the trellis. And why? Because silence is power, and you intended to keep the vicar under yours. You placed the letters in Mrs. Darnell's hands that she might play the visible villain while you remained the invisible one. A shudder ran through the room. Miss Clevenger's lips opened. closed. At last, she said, very low, he would have ruined the parish. He could not be trusted. A man who once— She broke off, biting the words. Perhaps, said Whimsy softly, but you chose blackmail over honesty. You chose theatre over truth. And like all bad dramatists, you misjudged your stage. The acoustics betrayed you. Whispers carry. Your own delay carried louder than you imagined. She rose suddenly, the teacup falling and shattering at her feet. It is not true, she cried. I never touched that parcel. Whimsy's monocle gleamed. Ah, but you arranged for another to do so, and the decoy lies with burnt hands as witness. Deny if you like, but the village has heard, and the echo will not be silenced. For a moment she swayed, then sank back into her chair, face white, lips mauve with denial, yet trembling with confession. The villagers, murmuring, turned inward upon themselves, already rehearsing the new gossip, already smoothing the scandal into anecdote. The vicar buried his face in his hands. Mrs. Darnell stared straight ahead, her painted lips tight as a seal over a jar of bitterness. Whimsy, satisfied, gathered his papers with languid elegance. You see, ladies and gentlemen, he said, the danger of architecture is that it makes every whisper immortal. Words spoken in one corner may return to haunt you in another. And silence, however carefully folded like a shawl, is never quite empty. It rustles. It speaks. He bowed slightly, signaled to Bunter, and together they strolled out into the fading light, leaving behind a room thick with echoes. Some of them indignant, some relieved, all inescapably damning. Outside, the sun was sinking. The mist had not yet risen again, but it would. Whimsy looked up at the clean sky, smiling faintly. Well, Bunter, another village purged by acoustics. I sometimes think the Almighty created echoes solely to keep us honest. Bunter, carrying the shawl and envelope as though they were relics, inclined his head. Very likely, my lord. And they walked on, the sound of their footsteps carrying clear across the green, as if the village itself wished to remember every step. The square of Little Malling was quieter that evening than any villager could remember. The reading-room door had barely closed upon the revelations when the audience scattered in uneasy knots, each group whispering furiously, glancing sideways at Miss Clevenger and Mrs. Darnell, then dispersing as if afraid of being seen too long in anyone's company. The silence left behind was thick, not peaceful, but expectant, like the hush before a storm decides whether it means to break. Whimsy, strolling back toward the inn with Bunter, seemed more animated than weary. His cane swung in time with his thoughts, and every so often he gave a little chuckle, as though privately amused at the way truth insists on dressing up as farce before presenting itself. Observe, Bunter, he said, how respectability collapses at the merest tug. Our Miss Clevenger, pillar of punctuality, proves to have been the stage manager of the entire performance. Mrs. Darnell, with her unfortunate mauve, reduced to a mere prompter, and the vicar, poor soul, cast as the trembling tragedian. Really, one should sell tickets. Yes, my lord, said Bunter gravely, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of amusement. At the inn, supper was served in the common parlour, where villagers tried and failed not to stare at Whimsy. He responded with exaggerated courtesy, quoting Shakespeare at the soup and congratulating the landlord's wife on producing a mutton pie that would console a bishop after a sermon. But when at last the room emptied and the clock ticked toward 10, his expression sobered. He sat by the fire, gazing into the embers, his voice softer now. What I cannot yet decide, Bunter, is whether Miss Clevenger's motive was the sordid one of money, the subtler one of power, or, more dangerously still, the desperate one of righteousness. She spoke as though she believed herself guardian of the parish's soul. That makes her either a hypocrite or a zealot. Both are equally alarming. Bunter, pouring out a glass of port, replied, There is also the question of the letters, my lord. Where did she obtain them? Without that lever, she could not have moved the vicar at all. Quite so. Old letters are like skeletons in cupboards, useful only to those who know how to rattle them at the proper moment. Tomorrow we must inquire discreetly into their provenance. I have a suspicion that they were not discovered by chance in some attic trunk. They were placed in her hands. By whom, and for what price, we shall learn. The inn clock chimed. Whimsy rose, stretching. And now, bed. Tomorrow the echoes will sound louder still, for every villager will add their own embroidery to the tale. By the time we leave, Bunter, little Malling, will have composed a tragedy worthy of Aeschylus, though beginning, as all English tragedies do, with tea. He retired upstairs, humming faintly. The following day dawned crisp and sharp, the mist burnt off by a brisk wind. Yet the atmosphere remained heavy. Doors opened cautiously. People crossed the square in haste, as though contact itself might prove incriminating. The vicar, pale and worn, attempted his usual morning walk, but retreated quickly under the weight of too many glances. Whimsy appeared from the inn, bright as a May morning, greeting all with such effusive good humor that several villagers blushed to discover themselves smiling back. He made his way directly to the millhouse, where the decoy girl, Mary, her name proved to be, still lay recovering. Dr. Redpath met him at the door. "She's improving." Shock nearly finished her, but she'll mend. "Her hands will scar, though. Scars," said Whimsy, "are merely history writing itself upon the body." "May I have a word with her?" In the parlor, Mary looked up timidly, her face wan. Whimsy sat beside her, voice kind. "You have been exceedingly brave, my dear. I would not weary you, but can you tell me again who gave you the parcel?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Mrs. Darnell. She said it was only soap, but she made me paint my lips first and wear the shawl. She said I was to sit at Miss Clevenger's place, order tea, then leave it as though I'd stepped out. She gave me 2 shillings. I didn't know." Her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know it would hurt." "No," said Whimsy gently. "You could not. That is precisely why you were chosen. But tell me, did she say who the parcel was for?" Mary shook her head. "Only that someone would take it. She said it wasn't my concern." Whimsy patted her shoulder. "You have done enough. Rest now outside." He turned to Bunter. "So, Mrs. Darnell executed the mechanics, but the design was larger. The parcel was bait, the girl a lure, the trellis, the stage, and Miss Clevenger, delayed precisely 12 minutes, had time to collect what she required while the village believed her absent. Elegant in its shabby little way." By afternoon, Whimsy summoned the principal players to the vicarage: Mrs. Darnell, Miss Clevenger, the vicar himself, and Mr. Darnell trailing miserably. They gathered in the dim study, the air thick with suppressed accusation. Whimsy remained standing, leaning lightly against the desk. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we may as well be frank. A parcel was passed yesterday, not of soap, but of silence. The question is, whose silence and why? Mrs. Darnell, you lent your mauve signature to the drama. Miss Clevenger, you timed your entrance to perfection. And you, Reverend Sir, were made the unwitting center of the play. Let us at last dispense with shadows." The vicar raised a shaking hand. "I will confess, my lord, if it will end this misery. Years ago, before I came to Little Malling, I wrote certain letters, unguarded, imprudent. They were kept. When they resurfaced, I begged that they remain unseen. Miss Clevenger promised me they would, provided I—" He broke off, color rising in his face. "Provided you allowed her a certain power over you," said Whimsy softly. "Yes, and when the hold weakened, the letters were placed in Mrs. Darnell's hands that she might rattle them afresh. The parcel was intended as proof of obedience. Something to remind you that silence has a price." Miss Clevenger spoke suddenly, her voice sharp. "It was for the parish. He would have shamed us all if those letters came out. I only meant to keep him quiet by coercion," said Whimsy. "And you, madam, contrived to keep your own hands clean by letting another paint hers mauve." Mrs. Darnell, trembling with fury, turned on her. "You used me. You let the village point at me while you played saint. You knew they'd believe it of me, not of you." "Because it was true," snapped Miss Clevenger. "You revel in gossip and cheap melodrama. Who better to front the play than you?" The two women glared, the vicar cowering between them. Whimsy lifted his hand. "Enough. The truth, like echoes, has now carried to every corner. Whatever further melodrama you attempt will sound only like repetition." He turned to the constable, waiting uneasily at the door. "Mr. Blaggs, the law may see little here but attempted extortion, yet the village has its own tribunal, more merciless than any court. These ladies will find their punishment in every turned back and whispered aside. That, perhaps, is justice enough." The constable looked relieved, nodded, and departed to spread the word. Whimsy bowed to the assembly. "And so, ladies, our play concludes. The vicar may resume his sermons. Mrs. Vale may serve her tea, and you, Miss Clevenger, may contemplate the peculiar acoustics of your conscience. Good day," he swept out, Bunter following, leaving the room vibrating with the echoes of words that could never be unsaid. That evening, the village square was calm again. Children played, a cart rattled past, and the tea-room lamps glowed as though nothing had happened. Yet every villager who glanced at Miss Clevenger or Mrs. Darnell looked quickly away, and every whisper carried further than intended. Whimsy and Bunter prepared to depart the next morning. As they packed, Whimsy remarked, "You see, Bunter, the whole affair began with a single cup of tea." Domesticity is the most dangerous of theatres, because it persuades us the play cannot possibly end in tragedy. Yet it does. "Yes, my lord," said Bunter, closing the case. On the train that carried them away from Little Marling, Whimsy settled into his seat, humming. A last cup, a folded shawl, a trellis, a mauve smear. What could be more English? One must be grateful to Providence for supplying such diversions. And now, Bunter, I think we might revive ourselves with a more innocent cup, untainted by melodrama. He lifted his glass as though toasting the invisible village fading behind them. His eyes twinkled, but his tone was grave. "To whispers, Bunter. May they always be heard by the right ears." The train carried them on, leaving Little Marling to nurse its scandal, its respectability cracked but not yet broken, and its echoes lingering in every parlour and pew.